It began with a silence so deliberate it felt rehearsed inside a sealed chamber at Kensington Palace, where even senior aides were turned away. When Prince William emerged, his expression was unreadable. But Andrew's absence from that meeting and the quiet removal of a title from official records hours later signaled something far more serious than routine royal business. Something irreversible had just been set in motion. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made that silence so unsettling wasn't just who was inside the room, but who wasn't. Prince Andrew, once a central figure in royal life, had not only been excluded, he had been deliberately kept at a distance from a decision that would ultimately redefine his place within the monarchy. Those familiar with palace operations began to sense that this was not a routine administrative review, not a ceremonial adjustment, but something far more calculated. Reports began to circulate quietly at first that legal advisors had been brought in not for consultation, but for execution, not of a person, but of a status. And in royal terms, that distinction carries a weight few outside the institution truly understand. Inside that restricted meeting, the atmosphere was said to be unusually tense. Senior palace officials, individuals accustomed to navigating decades of royal protocol, were reportedly instructed to observe absolute discretion. That phrase alone raised alarms among insiders because discretion in the palace is standard, but absolute discretion is rare. It suggests finality. It suggests that whatever decision is being made is not meant to be debated, delayed, or reversed. And when Prince William stepped out of that room, there were no clarifications, no reassurances, only a controlled silence that seemed to confirm the gravity of what had just occurred. Within hours, subtle changes began to surface. Not announcements, not press releases, but quiet edits almost surgical in their precision. Royal records were updated internally. Then, almost imperceptibly, the official website reflected those same changes. A title that had remained intact through years of controversy, scrutiny, and gradual withdrawal from public life was simply gone. No explanation attached. No ceremony marking its removal. Just absence. And in an institution built on symbolism, absence speaks louder than any statement. Media watchers were among the first to connect the dots. These were individuals who track every minor alteration in royal communication, every shift in language, every disappearance of a name or title, and what they saw didn't align with routine updates. It felt coordinated, intentional, almost as if the palace had been preparing for this exact moment, waiting for the right conditions to act. Soon, whispers began to ripple through royal correspondence circles. Words like final decision and long-anticipated move started appearing in private conversations, hinting that what had just happened was not sudden at all, but the conclusion of something much older, something quietly building behind closed doors. And perhaps most telling of all was the reaction, or lack of one, from within the palace itself. No denial, no clarification. Just a firm, unwavering silence that seemed to reinforce the message. This decision was not up for discussion. It had been made, executed, and absorbed into the structure of the monarchy with almost chilling efficiency. For those watching closely, it became clear that this was not just about removing a title. It was about drawing a line, one that had been avoided for years but could no longer be ignored. But the removal of a title was only the visible fracture. Behind it lay a calculated dismantling, years in the making. For years, it lingered like a ghost of a former life, Andrew's final royal title, quietly preserved even after every public role had been stripped away. Many believed it was untouchable, a relic protected by royal tradition. But tradition, as it turns out, can be rewritten, especially when the future of the crown is at stake. The slow unraveling of Prince Andrew's royal identity had not happened overnight. It had been a process measured, deliberate, almost painfully gradual. First came the withdrawal from public duties, framed as temporary, a pause rather than an end. Then the patronages began to disappear, one by one, quietly reassigned or dissolved. Military affiliations, once worn with pride and ceremony, were returned, stripped away with formal language that masked the deeper reality. Each step felt significant at the time, yet none of them delivered a complete severance. There was always something left behind, some fragment of status that remained untouched, as if the institution itself was reluctant to fully close the door. And at the center of that lingering connection stood his final title. It was not just a name or a formality, it was a symbol. A thread tying him, however faintly, to the fabric of royal authority. Those who understood the inner workings of the monarchy recognized its importance immediately. Titles within the royal system are not merely ceremonial, they represent continuity, legitimacy, and belonging. To hold even one is to remain, in some form, within the circle. And for Andrew, that final title became exactly that, a last anchor in a sea that had otherwise pulled away from him. But why had it remained for so long? The answer, according to those familiar with royal protocol, was far from simple. Legal frameworks, ceremonial precedents, and deeply rooted traditions created a web of complications that made its removal anything but straightforward. There were questions about authority, who had the power to revoke it, and under what conditions. There were concerns about precedent, what message such a move would send, not just within the family, but to the public and the institution as a whole. And above all, there was hesitation. Because removing that final title would not just be an administrative act, it would be a statement, a definitive break from the past. Behind closed doors, discussions had been ongoing for years. Some argued that leaving the title intact preserved a sense of dignity, a controlled distancing rather than a complete exile. Others believed that as long as it remained, it undermined the very reforms the monarchy was trying to project. Insiders have long suggested that these debates were not always unified. There were differing views, conflicting priorities, and a tension between preserving tradition and protecting the institution's future. And as public scrutiny intensified, that tension only grew stronger. Because outside the palace walls, patience was wearing thin. Public perception had shifted. What might once have been accepted as a quiet compromise was now being questioned, challenged, even criticized. The idea that a title could remain untouched, despite everything else changing, began to feel increasingly out of step with the times. And within the monarchy, that external pressure could not be ignored. The crown, after all, does not exist in isolation. It depends on trust, on credibility, on the belief that it can adapt when necessary. It was in this shifting landscape that Prince William's influence began to take clearer shape. No longer just the heir in waiting, he had become an active force in defining what the monarchy would look like in the years ahead. His approach, as many observers noted, leaned toward clarity and accountability. Where ambiguity once served as a shield, it now appeared as a weakness. And the existence of Andrew's final title, quiet, unresolved, lingering, stood in direct contrast to that vision. What had once been protected by silence was now being reconsidered under a far colder, more decisive lens. There was nothing impulsive about what came next. Every step had been mapped, every consequence anticipated. When Prince William finally acted, it wasn't just decisive, it was surgical. And those watching closely realized this wasn't just about Prince Andrew anymore. It was about redefining power inside the monarchy itself. For months, perhaps longer, there had been a quiet recalibration happening beneath the surface, a shift in authority that didn't rely on announcements but on influence, timing, and control. William, no longer simply the future king in theory, had begun operating with the weight of that future already in motion. Those familiar with palace dynamics had noted the change. His involvement in internal decisions had deepened, his presence in critical discussions had become more consistent, and most importantly, his tolerance for unresolved issues had grown increasingly thin. Andrew's lingering title, once treated as a delicate complication, had become something else entirely, a contradiction to the image William was carefully, deliberately shaping. This was not a decision made in isolation. Reports suggest that teams of legal advisors had been consulted extensively, not just to explore possibilities, but to construct a path that could not be undone. Because within the monarchy, reversibility is weakness. Every move must carry the weight of permanence. And so, what emerged from those consultations was not a single action, but a framework, one that combined constitutional authority with ceremonial precedent, ensuring that the removal of Andrew's title would stand on unshakable ground. It wasn't enough to act. It had to be justified in a way that left no room for challenge. At the same time, there was a quieter alignment taking place among senior members of the royal family. Not publicly, not even visibly, but in principle. Those who had long supported a more streamlined, modern monarchy found themselves, perhaps for the first time, in clear agreement. The institution, they believed, could no longer carry unresolved contradictions. It needed clarity. It needed consistency. And most of all, it needed to demonstrate that no title, no matter how historically protected, was beyond review. William, it seemed, had become the focal point of that belief, a figure willing to translate private consensus into public reality. What made the moment so striking, however, was not just the decision itself, but the precision of its execution. Insiders have suggested that the timing had been carefully chosen, aligned with internal readiness rather than external pressure. This was not a reaction. It was a culmination. Weeks, perhaps months of preparation distilled into a single, controlled action. And when that action came, it moved swiftly, legal confirmations secured, internal records updated, and the structure of Andrew's remaining authority quietly dismantled without disruption or delay. Then came the moment that, until then, had only existed in planning. The moment Andrew was formally informed. There was no spectacle, no dramatic confrontation, only the weight of finality delivered through the channels the monarchy has always relied upon. Controlled, measured, and absolute. Those familiar with such processes describe them as intentionally impersonal, designed to remove emotion from decisions that carry immense personal consequence. And yet, beneath that controlled delivery, the impact would have been undeniable. Because this was not just another step in a long process. This was the last step. And as that final connection to royal authority was severed, the implications began to ripple outward. Because in removing what remained of Andrew's status, the monarchy had done more than resolve a long-standing issue, it had altered the structure around him. And within that structure were others, individuals whose positions had quietly depended on the very thing that had just been taken away. But as Andrew's last connection to royal authority was severed, another consequence began to unfold, one that would leave Beatrice exposed. The shock didn't end with Andrew. Within hours, attention shifted to Princess Beatrice, who, until that moment, had quietly maintained a delicate position within royal circles. But with her father's final title gone, the ground beneath her shifted just as suddenly and far more publicly. For years, Beatrice had existed in a space that was neither fully inside nor entirely outside the monarchy's inner framework. She was not a senior working royal, yet she was never truly distant from the institution either. Her presence at key events, her continued association with royal lineage, and the subtle privileges that came with her family name had allowed her to maintain a careful balance. It was a position built on quiet continuity, sustained not by official roles but by proximity to legacy, to history, and most importantly, to her father's remaining connection to royal status. That connection, though often overlooked by the public, carried more weight than it appeared. Andrew's final title had functioned as a kind of invisible bridge, linking his immediate family to the institutional structure that had otherwise begun to move on without him. Through it, there remained a thread of recognition, a lingering acknowledgement that his branch of the family had not been entirely severed. And for Beatrice, that thread had quietly supported her place within royal circles, allowing her to move within them without fully belonging to their core. But when that title disappeared, so did the structure surrounding it. The shift was immediate, even if it wasn't formally announced. Invitations, once assumed, became uncertain. Associations that had once felt stable suddenly seemed conditional. The subtle signals that define royal standing, those unspoken indicators of inclusion and influence, began to change. And while nothing was publicly declared, those watching closely could sense it. The balance Beatrice had maintained for so long was no longer sustainable, because the foundation beneath it had been removed. What made the situation even more complex was the way it unfolded in the public eye. Media narratives quickly began to take shape, and among them, one phrase surfaced repeatedly: collateral damage. It was a term that captured the quiet tragedy of her position, someone not directly involved in the decisions that led to this moment, yet deeply affected by their outcome. And as that narrative spread, it brought with it a new kind of scrutiny. Not the scrutiny of controversy, but of uncertainty. Questions about her future role, her place within the monarchy, and the extent to which she would remain connected to its evolving structure began to circulate with increasing intensity. Inside the palace, however, there was no immediate clarification, no statement outlining what this meant for Beatrice, no reassurance about her position moving forward. Only silence. And that silence, much like the one that had surrounded the initial decision, carried its own message. It suggested that her situation was not an oversight, not an unintended consequence, but something understood, anticipated, and perhaps even accepted as part of the broader shift taking place. Because this was never just about one title, or even one individual. It was about the architecture of the monarchy itself, how it defines belonging, how it maintains credibility, and how it chooses to move forward while carrying the weight of its past. And in that process, the lines between personal and institutional consequences begin to blur. What happens to one inevitably affects others, especially those whose positions are tied not to formal roles, but to inherited connections. For Beatrice, that reality was now impossible to ignore. The space she once occupied had changed, and with it, the expectations surrounding her future. Whether she would adapt to that change, step away from it, or attempt to redefine her place within it remained uncertain. But what was clear was that her situation was no longer static. It was evolving, shaped by forces far beyond her control, and moving in a direction that had yet to fully reveal itself. What looked like a personal loss was, in reality, part of a much larger recalibration of the royal hierarchy. Behind the scenes, this wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Every move, every silence, every delayed response formed part of a broader strategy that insiders now describe as a complete institutional reset. And Andrew's removal was only the beginning. To understand what was really happening, you have to step back from the moment and look at the pattern. Because this didn't start with Andrew, and it certainly doesn't end with him. For years, the monarchy had been quietly evolving, shifting away from a sprawling network of extended royals towards something far more contained, far more controlled. The idea of a slimmed-down monarchy had been discussed in whispers long before it became visible in action. But discussions are one thing, execution is another. And what had once been theoretical was now unfolding in real time, with a precision that suggested long-term planning rather than reactive decision-making. At the center of this shift stood Prince William, not just as an heir preparing for the future, but as an architect actively shaping it. His vision, according to those familiar with internal thinking, was clear: a monarchy that is smaller, more focused, and above all, more accountable. No excess, no ambiguity. Every role defined, every position justified. In that framework, the existence of unresolved figures, those who occupied space without clear function, became increasingly difficult to sustain. Andrew's situation, long tolerated as a complex exception, began to stand out as something that no longer fit the model. But this transformation was never going to be abrupt. It had to be gradual, almost invisible at first. Distancing from controversial figures didn't happen through dramatic announcements, it happened through absence. Fewer appearances, fewer mentions. Gradual withdrawal from the rhythms of royal life until the connection itself began to feel distant. It was a strategy rooted not in confrontation, but in erosion. And by the time a final decision was made, much of the separation had already taken place in the public consciousness. What made this approach particularly effective was the coordination behind it. Palace communications and legal teams were not operating independently, they were aligned, moving in tandem to ensure that every step served a larger purpose. Messaging was controlled, timing was deliberate, and even silence was used as a tool. Because in an institution like the monarchy, what is not said can carry as much weight as what is declared. And in this case, silence created space for interpretation, for adjustment, and ultimately, for acceptance. At the same time, there was an undeniable external force shaping these decisions: public trust. The monarchy, for all its tradition and ceremony, relies heavily on perception. It must be seen as stable, credible, and aligned with the values of the society it represents. And when that perception is challenged, the response cannot be purely symbolic, it has to be structural. Removing Andrew's final title was not just about internal consistency, it was about reinforcing a message to the public that the institution is willing to act when necessary, even when those actions carry personal cost. Seen in this light, the decision becomes part of something much larger than a single individual. It becomes a statement of intent, a signal that the monarchy is entering a new phase, one defined by clarity and control rather than tradition alone. A phase where difficult decisions are no longer postponed, but executed when the moment demands it. And if Andrew's removal felt decisive, it's because it was meant to be. Not as an isolated act, but as a cornerstone in a broader effort to reshape the institution for the future. But even the most carefully executed strategy comes with consequences, especially when legacy and loyalty collide. There was no statement, no denial, no visible reaction. But insiders say the silence surrounding Prince Andrew in the days that followed was more telling than any public response. Because for the first time, there was nothing left to defend. In the immediate aftermath, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that was impossible to ignore. Andrew simply disappeared from the rhythm of royal life. No appearances, no acknowledgements, not even the carefully managed glimpses that had once signaled a continued, if reduced, presence within the institution. It was as if a door had closed, not with force, but with certainty. And those who understood the subtle language of the monarchy recognized what that absence meant. This wasn't temporary distance. This was withdrawal without return. Reports began to circulate, cautiously, suggesting a mix of frustration and resignation behind the scenes. Not the kind that spills into public view, but the kind that settles inward, heavy and unspoken. Because unlike previous moments when titles had been removed, roles redefined, or associations quietly severed, there had always been something left. Some fragment of identity that could still be held onto, some position that offered a sense of continuity. This time, there was none. The final title had not just been symbolic, it had been the last remaining link to institutional relevance. And now, even that was gone. What followed was not just personal isolation, but institutional distance. The support structures that had once existed, even in reduced form, seemed to recede further. Invitations were no longer a question, they simply ceased to exist. Interactions that had once been maintained out of protocol became increasingly rare, then absent altogether. Within royal circles, where hierarchy and association define every interaction, the shift was unmistakable. Andrew was no longer being managed within the system. He had been moved beyond it. For those observing closely, the contrast with earlier moments was striking. When previous titles had been stripped, there had been a sense of negotiation, of careful balance between consequence and preservation. The monarchy had acted, but it had also contained the impact, ensuring that the individual remained, in some form, within its broader structure. This time, the approach was different. There was no containment, no partial retention. The decision carried a sense of completion that had not been seen before. It was not just another step in a long process, it was the end of that process. And that finality carried its own weight, because in a system built on legacy, on continuity, on the preservation of lineage, removing the last visible marker of status is not just an administrative act, it is a redefinition. It changes how an individual is seen, how they are positioned, and ultimately, how they are remembered within the institution itself. For Andrew, that redefinition was now complete, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any explanation ever could. And yet, the deeper impact wasn't measured in titles lost, but in what it meant for the future of the royal bloodline. For Princess Beatrice, the question now isn't what was lost, but what comes next. With the structure around her fundamentally changed, she faces a reality few royals ever publicly confront: rebuilding a role without the framework that once defined it. For most of her life, Beatrice's position had been shaped not by formal responsibility, but by inheritance, by the quiet certainty that her place, while not central, was still secured within the wider royal system. She existed in that in-between space, where visibility could be adjusted and expectations remained flexible. But now, that space has narrowed. The monarchy itself is evolving, becoming more focused, more selective, and far less accommodating to those who exist on its edges. And in that new structure, being a non-working royal is no longer a neutral position. It is a question mark. The challenge she faces is not immediate, but it is undeniable. Without the institutional backing that once gave her presence meaning, every step forward must now be defined differently. There are paths, of course. A quieter life, away from the pressures of royal association, where identity is shaped by personal choices rather than inherited roles. Or a gradual re-engagement, carefully aligned with the expectations of a monarchy that is itself redefining who belongs at its core. But neither path is simple, and neither comes with guarantees. Because the rules are changing, and the clarity that once guided those decisions is no longer as certain as it once seemed. Her relationship with Prince William now carries a weight it didn't before. Not openly, not in any declared way, but in the subtle dynamics that define royal hierarchy. William represents the future of the monarchy, and with that comes the authority to shape who remains within its central framework. For Beatrice, that means navigating a connection that is both personal and structural, where familiarity meets formality, and where every interaction exists within a broader context of change. There is no clear roadmap for that kind of relationship, only the understanding that it will play a role in determining what comes next. At the same time, public perception adds another layer of complexity. There is sympathy and acknowledgement that she stands at the intersection of decisions she did not make, yet must now live with. But sympathy does not translate into position. The monarchy does not operate on sentiment, it operates on structure, on purpose, on clearly defined roles. And while the public may see her as caught in the aftermath, the institution sees something else entirely. A figure whose place must now be reconsidered within a system that is becoming increasingly precise about its boundaries. This is where the deeper challenge emerges. Because what Beatrice is facing is not just a shift in status, it is a shift in identity. For generations, royal identity has been something inherited, something that existed independently of action. But that is changing. Now, identity must be justified, aligned with function, supported by relevance. And for someone whose position has always existed just outside the core, that transition is not just difficult, it is transformative. What happens next will not unfold in a single moment. It will be gradual, shaped by decisions both public and private, by opportunities taken or declined, and by the evolving expectations of a monarchy that is redefining itself in real time. And as that process continues, the implications extend beyond her alone. Because in a system built on lineage, every shift affects not just the present, but the future that follows. Because in a monarchy built on continuity, even one removal can reshape generations. What happened behind palace walls wasn't just a decision, it was a declaration. A signal that the monarchy is no longer willing to carry the weight of its past at the expense of its future. And in that moment, the rules quietly changed. Because this was never simply about removing a title or redefining one individual's place. It was about something far more profound, a shift in how the institution sees itself, and more importantly, how it chooses to survive. Under the growing influence of Prince William, the monarchy is stepping into a new era, one that demands clarity where ambiguity once thrived, and accountability where tradition once provided protection. The old approach, gradual, cautious, often hesitant, has been replaced with something sharper, more decisive. And while that change may not always be visible on the surface, its effects are already being felt at every level of the royal structure. At the heart of this transformation lies a difficult truth. Tradition alone is no longer enough. For generations, the monarchy has relied on its history as both shield and foundation, a way to maintain continuity even in moments of crisis. But history can also become a burden, especially when it prevents necessary change. And what this moment has revealed is that the balance between honoring the past and securing the future is no longer optional, it is essential. The crown must adapt, not just to remain relevant, but to maintain the trust that allows it to exist at all. That trust has become one of the most powerful forces shaping internal decisions. Public perception, once managed carefully from a distance, now plays a direct role in how the monarchy operates. Every action, every silence, every shift is interpreted, analyzed, and ultimately judged. And in that environment, the cost of inaction can be greater than the cost of change. Removing Prince Andrew's final title was not just about internal consistency, it was about demonstrating that the institution is capable of holding itself accountable, even when doing so carries personal and historical weight. The finality of that decision cannot be overstated. For Andrew, it marked the end of any remaining connection to royal identity as it had once been understood. No lingering roles, no symbolic ties, no quiet acknowledgements left to preserve a sense of belonging. It was, in every meaningful way, a complete separation. And while the process that led to this moment was gradual, the result is absolute. There is no ambiguity left, no space for interpretation. The line has been drawn, and it is not meant to be crossed again. But beyond the immediate impact, there is a message embedded in this moment, one that extends far beyond a single individual or even a single generation. It is a message about responsibility, about the expectations placed on those who are part of the monarchy, and about the consequences of failing to meet them. Future generations will not just inherit titles, they will inherit a system that demands more from them, one that is less forgiving of misalignment and more focused on purpose. And perhaps that is the most significant change of all. The monarchy is no longer simply preserving itself, it is redefining itself, stripping away what no longer fits, reinforcing what remains, and shaping a future that is built not just on legacy, but on intention. It is a process that is as difficult as it is necessary, one that requires decisions that are not always comfortable, but are ultimately unavoidable. In the end, the crown endures not by preserving every legacy, but by deciding which ones it can no longer afford to keep. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.